God was at work simultaneously in several European countries at more or less the same time, raising up very different people in quite a remarkable way. One thinks, first of all, for instance, of Martin Luther in Germany, who was just the person who was needed at that very early stage. Someone who has been described by Dr. Lloyd Jones, I think, as an earthquake of a man, a very vigorous man, a very earthy individual, had the sense of humour of a German peasant, a man with remarkable physical courage, and who at that early stage in the work of Reformation needed to face the very real possibility of losing his life, and who recovered the doctrine of justification by faith, who was put on trial on 4 separate occasions. First of all, having made his protest against indulgences in 1517, the famous protest which he made on October the 31st by nailing a list of grievances known as the 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, which was an invitation to hold a public debate on the subject. Indulgences, by the way, were certificates produced by the Pope inviting people to purchase time off in purgatory. Luther, in publishing this invitation to a debate, was questioning the validity of these certificates. Now, this sparked off a controversy, and Luther's opponent, the man who'd been publishing these certificates, a man named Tetzel, never took Luther up on the invitation to hold this debate. But it did mean that Luther was put on trial, first of all by the order of monks to which he belonged, the Augustinian order, then by a cardinal appointed by the Pope, then by the Pope himself, and then finally by the Emperor of Germany, the Emperor Charles V, at a town in the Rhineland, a place called Worms. Now this was at the Parliament of Germany, which was called the Diet or Diet. So it's known as the Diet of Worms. And it was there that Luther took his famous stand. He was invited to admit that he had written a number of books on the subject of the doctrine of justification by faith alone, which really boils down to this. How do we get the verdict with God? How does God acquit someone? How do we become acceptable before God? How do we get into heaven? And Luther had found, as he studied the scriptures, because he had been appointed the professor of biblical theology in the University of Wittenberg, and he had discovered this, that we are acquitted before God simply and solely because of the merit that the Lord Jesus Christ has acquired for us through his righteous life. We can only get into heaven because of what Jesus has done for us, and not because of anything that we have done to make us righteous or to make us worthy. When Luther discovered this, he said it was like walking through open doors into paradise. Initially, when Luther read Romans chapter 1, verse 17, the righteous man will be justified by his faith. The just shall live by faith. He was worried sick. But then he began to realize that this means that the righteous person does not mean the person who is righteous because of his own efforts, but rather the person who is righteous because he has been given the gift of the righteousness that Jesus Christ has acquired. Luther realized that he didn't have to worry anymore. He didn't need to think that he had to become righteous all by himself. Instead, Jesus Christ had made him righteous. Jesus Christ had given him his righteousness. When Luther began to write about the Christian principles that he had discovered, and for example in the year 1520 he wrote 3 books which were extremely important on the doctrine of justification by faith and on the way that the Christian church had been led captive with the Roman Catholic doctrine of the sacraments. This spread like wildfire throughout Germany, and it all took hold very rapidly. Within the next decade, God raised up another individual, a man named John Calvin, who was born in the north of France in an area called Picardy, an area well known to British soldiers from the First World War. He grew up in the city of Noyon. Now, he's a very different man from Martin Luther, a much more cerebral, quiet individual, a creature of libraries, a natural scholar, and he was destined for a life of retirement and study. He didn't want to be a preacher or anything of the sort. He would have liked a life of retirement, and he was traveling through the German and French borderlands and made a detour through Geneva when he was waylaid by a man called Farel and accosted and told by Farel that he had to stay in Geneva and help the work of Reformation in that city, or that God would curse his retirement. Farel literally more or less grabbed hold of him. Whether one would regard this as an acceptable method of guidance is really quite interesting, because Farel was a huge man and more or less said that unless Calvin stayed put in Geneva, that God would not let him move an inch. And I think Calvin was thoroughly frightened. It's really interesting to see what happened next. But Calvin did stay put and began the work of Reformation there. And, well, he stayed there for 2 years. But things were extremely difficult for him at first, and he had to leave and go to Strasbourg, where he stayed for a while until the citizens of Geneva begged him to come back, where he then continued his work and taught his way steadily through a great many books of the Bible. Geneva became a hotbed. People came from all over Europe, including a great many from England, because this was the period when, shortly after the brief reign of King Edward VI, who had been brought up as a small boy during the latter years of King Henry VIII's reign as a Protestant, who himself had allowed a brief period of Reformation in the national church in England and had encouraged evangelical bishops to begin a national Reformation in England, and who had sadly died of tuberculosis and had been followed by his sister, Queen Mary I. Well, Mary sadly was a Roman Catholic all her days, and she had thrown everything into reverse and brought in an Archbishop of Canterbury, Reginald Pole, who started a disastrous policy of persecution. Many of the finest evangelicals in England had been burned at the stake. Others fled to Geneva and began to absorb what Calvin was doing there, and had begun to feel that what was happening in England was the creation of a church that was only halfly reformed. And seeing what was taking place in Geneva, learned the lesson of what later became Puritanism. They wanted to go back to England and turn the English church into something that was even more reformed than they had seen created during Edward's reign.